Okay, there we go. All right. Um, so before we get going with those 3 learning goals, I'm pretty sure all of you have had this information yelled at you via me several times. But just in case you need it again, this is my email. This is my appointment link. You can book appointments with me 30 to 45 minutes. Great time to really dig deep into a project that you're working on, whether it be a systematic review that you need some help getting going with, or another project that goes for students and faculty alike. So please feel free to reach out to me in either of these ways. The other piece of information that I really want to share with you before we get going is our LibGuide for the social science systematic and scoping reviews here at Rutgers. So this is a resource that I've put together. It's kind of the conglomeration of all of the different trainings and peer-to-peer learning and best practice that I've identified over the past couple of years. And I'm continually updating it whenever there's new things that come out. So please feel free to keep that in your bookmarks bar, because I think people have found it pretty useful so far. Just to show you what it looks like, it basically has step-by-step instructions and resources for every step in the systematic review process and every step in the scoping review process, along with different examples of different types of reviews, all the collected resources. I keep all of the recordings of these workshops on that page, and then also a little bit of information about how I can help you further with your review. All right. So let's start by talking about what a systematic review is. I'm sure we've all read them, but what do they actually do? You know, what's their purpose? Why do they exist? They are basically a way to synthesize all of the available evidence on a very specific topic. And I should say all available quality evidence, because a big part of a systematic review is appraising for quality. Researchers conducting systematic reviews use explicit methods aimed at minimizing bias. And this quote I really, really like. It's from the Cochrane Handbook of Systematic Reviews. And Cochrane is kind of a big name in the evidence synthesis world, which we'll discuss in a moment. Yeah, so I like to think of a systematic review as a extremely strategic, extremely comprehensive synthesis of a very specific research question, bearing in mind that all of the studies that are included have also gone through a appraisal for quality. Why do a systematic review? That's a question I get a lot. You know, I hear people that come to me and say, I want to do a systematic review. And then it turns out they really don't need to do one, right? You know, they might actually, a literature review or a narrative review or a scoping review might be kind of the best path forward. And that's completely fine, right? And so I think having an understanding of what a systematic review's purpose is in our scholarly conversations is also really important. So why do a systematic review? The biggest reason is to inform decision-making. Systematic reviews started in the health sciences for practitioners to be able to understand all of the different evidence across all of the different papers published on one particular intervention. So we kind of saw that trickle up in a way to where it informed policy then also. And then we saw it move to the social sciences, where we see it now more with social science interventions or client care, for instance. Shout out to all the social work folks here. Or it's kind of to make evidence more available and understandable, right? So instead of having to read 50 papers on a specific intervention, you can read one paper that synthesizes them all and talks about kind of the conclusions that they all come to, which in our busy lives, that can be very useful as well. So these are kind of the big reasons to do a systematic review. Questions so far from anyone? Okay, and at any point, please feel free to throw questions in the chat or raise your hand. So I want to talk for a minute about the difference between a scoping review and a systematic review. Those of you that came to the initial evidence synthesis workshop, the one where I just talked about what evidence synthesis is, this will be familiar to you. So scoping reviews and systematic reviews are both types of evidence synthesis. They're cousins. It's just that a scoping review has a broader question. A scoping review generally has different aims as well because of that question. So, for a particular topic, the scoping review will probably have a broader research question and will kind of be trying to do reconnaissance or assessment on the scope of the literature that exists on a particular intervention, for example. Whereas a systematic review is really to search for every available study, appraise it, and then synthesize it into one kind of conclusive finding, right? So they're both extremely systematic in their searching. Both of them want to find every available piece of literature on a certain topic. It's just that the aims are different. And because of those aims, a systematic review has the critical appraisal component to the studies, whereas a scoping review isn't concerned about the quality of the evidence. It's just concerned with identifying that the evidence exists in relation to the other evidence out there. Is that differentiation clear to everybody? Okay, awesome. So here are just a couple of examples of some question formats that you might encounter for a scoping review versus a systematic review. For a systematic review, we might be looking at something like how effective is an intervention in a specific population, whereas the scoping review might say, what interventions are used for outcome X in population Y, so much broader. Systematic review might say, what is the outcome of intervention X in population Y in comparison with population Z? And that is, different than maybe like, what are the characteristics of the literature on an intervention X in population Y? And then systematic reviews might say, what is the outcome of intervention X in specific context Y versus, what are the outcomes of intervention X in population Y, right? So you can see that there's similarities, right? It's just that the scoping reviews tend to do a broader capture rather than an assessment of a specific intervention and the evidence that's been produced from the outcomes. So with that, I want to do a little poll. I have created a poll that's got 2 research questions. And I want you to decide which one is a systematic review and which one is a scoping review. Go ahead and launch that. Can everybody see the poll? Okay. Give us a minute or so. All right, I'm seeing some good answers. So the first question, the first research question is, what reported student outcomes exist in K-6 classrooms that use trauma-informed teaching? Yeah, so everyone was correct. That would be a scoping review, right? It's a bit of a broader question, what exists out there rather than, assessing a particular piece of evidence because of the outcome. And then the second question, what is the impact of permanent supportive housing programs on California adults with a documented history of a mental illness? Yeah, so that's much more specific and would kind of lead to a much more finite set of data to analyze if you were going to do a systematic review on that topic. All right, awesome. Okay. I want to talk a little bit about the major players in the evidence synthesis world, who gives the guidelines, who makes the manuals, who determines what the best practices are. So there are a bunch of really great kind of figureheads in the evidence synthesis world. Three of them that you'll hear mentioned daily if you do work in this area are the Joanna Briggs Institute, which is a health science institute out of Australia that publishes their own systematic reviews, has a library of evidence synthesis, and then also produces really excellent manuals for different types of evidence synthesis. We have PRISMA, which is a reporting standard. We're going to talk more about PRISMA in a moment. And then we have Cochrane. Who's heard of Cochrane? Probably a few people, maybe. So Cochrane is kind of like the originator of the evidence synthesis library for the health sciences. So they publish their own journal. They have their own huge library. You can write systematic reviews for them. You can peer review systematic reviews for them. And they're mainly focused in the health sciences, but they still create really great guidance, tutorials. They have this huge YouTube library that's really useful, that can be applied to the social sciences, even if the research questions that we're looking at are a little bit different. In terms of social science specific resources, the biggest kind of collective that resembles Cochrane or JBI, and I think actually Cochrane is a kind of main stakeholder, is the Campbell collaboration. I just took a 4-day long, like all-day training on systematic reviews, and it was taught by some librarians who have who work with the Campbell collaboration frequently. So they have, again, really great tutorials, and they're all health science focused. So really super useful for our particular disciplines, and translating a lot of those health science concepts into the social science realm. And then lastly, we have Systematic Reviews in the Social Sciences, A Practical Guide, which is a book that I took a very pixelated screenshot of. And it is a really nice kind of step-by-step. We have 2 copies in the library. I bought us a second one because I kind of felt like we needed it. So if you ever want to check that out, or you're even like, Julia, I need this chapter from this book, can you take a picture of it for me? Let me know, and I can grab you some of that, because they don't make a digital copy. So we only have it on the shelf, unfortunately. But it is also a great book, highly recommend. So that's kind of the major players in the evidence synthesis world. You'll see in the LibGuide that I made, that I shared in the chat, that those kind of 5 names are sprinkled in there a lot, and for good reason. They really have created some of the most digestible best practices for evidence synthesis. So now let's talk about PRISMA. So I mentioned PRISMA on the last slide, and PRISMA is basically a checklist of reporting standards. So surface level, PRISMA gives you a really nice snapshot of everything you should include in a systematic review, along with kind of an explanation of what that should entail. So I'm just going to click on the link here, show you what this looks like. Oh, thank God. Okay. So this website was down for like a month and I was so worried that I was going to be down today, but it's not. So it's a statement, it's a checklist. There's also an expanded checklist, so if you want like more elaboration, but most systematic reviews, when you read them in the methods, they'll say we followed PRISMA. There's a separate extension for scoping reviews. So if you're writing a scoping review, there's a version for scoping reviews. But the PRISMA statement is really kind of the gold standard for kind of minimum reporting standards to follow during a review. And it is just super, super useful. Highly recommend it being your first stop when you're thinking about a review. Questions about any of the kind of overview stuff we've talked about so far? Okay, awesome. I want to talk a little bit about the difference between a qualitative systematic review and a quantitative systematic review. So qualitative systematic review is going to be more narrative, as would be expected. It's going to be a narrative synthesis of the studies that you determine are valid for inclusion in your review. And I'll have an example of that in the next slide. A quantitative systematic review is going to be a meta-analysis. Has anybody heard of the term meta-analysis before? Yeah. So it's statistical practice. It combines all of the collective results of all of the studies, right? So it takes the data from each study that you've identified and puts them all together in a digestible way that kind of draws a conclusion. So it gives a statistical picture. You can't do a meta-analysis without doing a systematic review first. Can anybody tell me why that might be? Some people say, oh, I just want to do the meta-analysis. I just want to do the statistics part. I don't want to find all the, can I just like look at like 3 articles and do the meta-analysis?
I mean, you need to know what you're analyzing,
Right.
what you're analyzing for. You need some sort of research question or research aim for it. So
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not really going to do anyone any good to draw conclusions from just a couple of studies. If you really want to understand the impact of a particular intervention, you've got to find all of the examples of what that intervention has impacted, Yeah, so exactly. So if you ever read a paper that's like meta-analysis, but doesn't talk about how they got the studies for the meta-analysis, throw the paper away. Okay, quick examples. So this is a table from a qualitative systematic review. Let me zoom in a little bit. Where's my zoom? There's my zoom. So we can see they've split it up kind of into split it up into categories. And those categories are kind of going to be determined by the evidence that you find, right? So you devise the table based on that. So we see they have the author, kind of the citation, the aims, sample characteristics, the setting of the service, measure of social climate and aggression, reliability, statistical findings. They do a little conclusion here, and then they give it a quality assessment score, which we'll talk a little bit more about quality assessment, critical appraisal a little later on. So you can see that this is super comprehensive. It's super detailed. Even though it's not a meta-analysis in a forest plot, there is still a huge degree of systematizing done, even though it's in a more of a narrative format. We have a quantitative synthesis. This is a meta-analysis that I pulled from a systematic review. I'm not going to pretend that I'm super great at stats, but this basically is what a meta-analysis looks like. I took like a mini class on how to read them, so I know how to read them now, but that is less of the part of what a librarian helps with. We're more of the search side of things, although I definitely have resources if folks need help with the meta-analysis elements as well. And I thought I saw a hand up. Did somebody have a hand up and they put it down?
Yeah, that was me. I might have just missed this moment. So you're saying there's the qualitative and the quantitative of the systematic review, and the qualitative is more the narrative engagement with the findings. What if you're doing a qualitative, like a systematic review of qualitative literature? Is that does it have a different name, or is that also qualitative systematic review? It seems like a double name. Anyways, okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and that's something I was kind of confused about too. It took me a lot of reading to like suss that out. So, yes, so if you're doing a systematic review that's just of qualitative literature, it would be a qualitative systematic review. If you were doing a systematic review that included a bunch of like mixed method studies, or maybe you wanted to assess qualitative and quantitative studies, then you might do both. You might have a table with the narrative synthesis and a meta-analysis. So there's no like wrong way to do it. It's just that there's two different, in your paper, I mean, there's no like, you have to do it this way. It's just, these are kind of the two different ways that we see the evidence represented. if that makes sense, Natalie. I see a chat. Okay, awesome. Oh, Andrea, I'm sorry, I missed your question. If I'll be sharing the slides. Yes, I will absolutely share the slides. Don't feel like you have to take a ton of notes. Yeah. Yes, I will share the slides. They actually all live on the LibGuide here. So right below this will be the systematic review notes, or I'm sorry, slides and the video. Okay. So that covers all of the kind of overarching concepts. I want to dive into the review steps, which is going to be really kind of the meat of our time together. So buckle in. I also want to preface this by saying that this is a ton of information. I don't want to like information overload you. So all of the resources I have are not kind of available here. They're all on the LibGuide, but I want to make sure that we get more conceptual confidence today than we do like knowing every resource that ever exists for every step. So that's kind of my goal, because this is a lot of steps, a lot of information, is to just make sure that you feel confident kind of starting one of these and knowing what it is when we leave here today. All right, review steps. Before you start your review, there is a zero with step, which is to form your team. Systematic reviews should be done in a team, with very rare exceptions. Those exceptions usually being that the review is done for a dissertation or a thesis. That in that case, it's not really feasible for you to do it as a team-based project because you have to have, sole author credit on your finished product. But for reviews that are, the goal is to publish them in a journal, the team is essential. The reason that you form a team when you're doing a systematic review is to avoid bias. You're going to get to the point in the steps of the review where it's time to decide which of the studies, you're going to find thousands of studies when you're searching. You have to decide which of them is going to be included in review. If you are one person deciding that, it's going to be more likely that there's a bias in decision than if there are two or three or more people making those decisions together. There's kind of a more, there's a layer of inter-rater reliability kind of built into that. The other reason is that it makes the review a lot easier. It's hard to have subject matter expertise in statistics if you're doing a quantitative systematic review, and expertise in the searching and information retrieval elements. I don't know if I've ever met anyone that really has all three of those skill sets to the degree that they would feel confident doing a systematic review by themselves. So, it's really beneficial to everyone to kind of bring a group together that's got a variety of skills, sort of like the Ocean's movies. You're all working together towards a common goal, and you all have your very specific skill sets. And then we have step one, define your objective and your questions. So this might be overkill slightly, and if it is, please feel free to tell me to speed it along. But it's really important to kind of really clearly articulate what you're trying to accomplish. So I really liked this Harpin et al. Systematic review because they said it super clearly. The objectives of this review were to assess how self-esteem and social function are impaired in ADHD, to compare to long-term outcomes of untreated and treated ADHD in childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, and to identify any factors that affect self-esteem and social function. So they just said it straight out. This, I think, really benefits the reader, and it also benefits you for the future, because when you get into the nitty-gritty of screening your articles, searching for articles, it's really easy to derail based on what you find. We think of things like scope creep. So the idea that you want to keep broadening the topic because of what you find, or you want to narrow the topic because of what you find. Returning to this objective can help everybody kind of stay on the same page. We also need to think really clearly about the frameworks that we're going to use for writing our research question. I've just added a few here. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with PICO, which stands for Population, Intervention, Context / Comparison, and Outcome. The traditional PICO was with comparison for the health sciences, but for the social sciences, we've broadened it a little bit to include context as well. Then we have PCC, which is used mostly in scoping reviews. That's population, concept, and context. And then we have CHOW, which is a newer framework that I've been seeing some research methods courses teaching, which stands for client, intervention, alternative, and outcome, which makes sense for those social work professions as well. And all of these, again, are in the LibGuide. So this is just a screenshot of that first step. You can see it says formulate your research question. So these frameworks and many more live there as well. I want to do a quick closer look at PICO. So I've used just some guiding questions that you can use to define your topic. So for instance, starting with population, how is it defined? Think about things like age, gender, ethnic group, a medical condition, even like users of a particular product or service, right? Intervention, how is the phenomenon being treated or addressed? Comparison or context, what are we comparing this against in the instance of comparison, or for context, what is the cultural or social significance of any of the other elements of the study, right? And then lastly, the outcome, what are the results? So I want to practice this real quick and just like brainstorm a quick PICO and then write a research question from it. Again, might be overkill, but I sometimes feel like it's useful to do it all together. So somebody throw a population in the chat. Foster youth, perfect. An intervention. And it doesn't have to make, complete sense. It's more about writing the question at this point. I know we're all like racking our brains like, okay, what are some interventions? Substance use, yeah, awesome. Substance use prevention. Let's do, since we're thinking more about the social sciences, let's do C as context. So what's a social or cultural significance that we could think of placing in this particular research question? Sometimes I think this fits within population too. So like I might think about like rural areas, maybe. Let's think about that. And then outcome. What are the results of interest? What do we want to study as a result of substance use prevention in rural foster youth? Maybe like smoking cessation, increased wellness. I like that. Access to interventions. Oh yeah, that would be cool. Yeah, we have a bunch. A lot of different outcomes. 3 different reviews you could write on this topic. So putting it all together, we might do something like, what is the effect or What is the effect of substance use prevention on foster youths? On foster youths, wellness in rural areas. There we go. Not my best question that I've ever written. We'd probably finesse it a little bit. But I personally feel like kind of breaking it down into these PICO elements helps a lot. And again, when you get into the weeds of the review, being able to return to those elements is super, super important. It helps you kind of frame your inclusion, exclusion criteria as well, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right. Second step in a review is to write your protocol. Your protocol is your game plan for your review. It's not a full paper, but it does take some time because it kind of requires you to walk through all of the steps and plans that you've made for your review. So it details your research question. You usually include one search strategy for one database, so that you show that you have a plan for how you're going to look for the sources that you're going to use, and a plan for data extraction. So like, how are you going to get the data out of the studies, analyze it? How are you going to critically appraise the studies that you look at? All that good stuff. You register a protocol on a registry. And we're going to talk about that more in depth on the next slide. And in terms of guidance, Prisma, which we've already talked a little bit about, has an extension checklist for protocols specifically. So this has every single element that you should include in your protocol, wherever you register it. So, talks about the authors, the contact information, any funding or support. Then we get into rationale and objectives. You set your criteria, you put one search strategy draft. The reason I really like protocols, and I think they're a good idea, is because, it's not like you can't write a review if you don't register your protocol somewhere or you don't create a protocol somewhere, but it really gives you a chance to think about all of the elements that you're going to need to write this review before you really write it. And it forces you oftentimes to foresee some of the issues that you're going to run into down the line in ways that I think make for a smoother ride if you do write them. And it's just becoming more and more best practice to write and register a review. So talking about registering reviews, why do you think it is a best practice to register a protocol?
May I ask a question? You might be getting at this. So is this registry of protocols available for everyone to search and see? So I was going to ask that question before you asked this question. So if I wanted to do, go research a topic, I could go see if it's been done or at least registered by someone else. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
So yeah, you completely answered my question. It prevents the duplication of evidence synthesis. It also kind of does the opposite, right? So if you register your review, if you get scooped, you can say like, I did this first. Hey, I don't think that's as common in the social sciences. My fiance is a physicist, and this happens all the time in physics. So they put their preprints out, like, they write like 3 sentences and they're like, put it online, so that nobody knows, everybody knows we had this idea. But yeah, it can be really useful, in that regard too.
So you would register like kind of before you actually have your paper. Oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah. So you do some of the work ahead of time. For instance, you make your plan. You'll do some searching, which we'll talk about in a moment. So you do include one kind of draft search. You talk about the tools you're going to use. Sometimes people talk about like who's going to do what on the study. And then it gets registered. And my next slide is a little bit more about like where to register basically. I have a big list on the LibGuide. But there's just a couple that I want to highlight. You know, it really depends on what your topic is and the type of review that you're doing. So for instance, Prospero is really a famous registry. Where are you, Prospero? There you are. Where everyone tries to register, but they will only accept reviews that have at least one health outcome. So some social science protocols don't fit within that. And that's okay, you know. But if you can register in Prospero, I would say, you know, try it out. A couple other that I'll mention, OSF is one of my favorites. So that's the Open Science Foundation registry. I'm just going to search our topic.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So we can see this is their registration here.
Can you
Yeah.
register, or should you register for more than more than one registry?
You can, yeah, sure. I don't see that a lot. I mostly see when I read a systematic review, oh, we registered at blah, 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 just one place. But I don't think there's any reason you wouldn't be able to or shouldn't. But you can see this is, you know, this is a lengthier one than some of the other ones I've seen. Let's take a look at maybe some of the other ones here. I'm going to add systematic review. There we go. Let's try that. Oh, withdrawn. Okay, cool. Sometimes that happens too.
Why was it withdrawn? Because they never did it?
Yeah, it looks like it. Let's see. Significant changes in the design. Yeah, so they probably started and couldn't come to a consensus on something and went back to the drawing board, which happens, you know, sometimes. Another good reason to write a protocol, right? Because then you're not halfway through the paper before you realize that that's a problem. Let's check this one here. So this one is, yeah, doesn't have any text supplemental files. Let's see. Okay, well, that's not helpful. But yeah, anyway, I don't want to spend too long on this, but these are,
It looks like I just did substance use prevention and all the first ones come up. They're all like clinical trials. So it's like,
Mhm.
I'm assuming they're registered at the clinical trial registry and then just showing up here, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, that could also definitely be the case. You could register a clinical trial protocol on OSF. OSF is like domain / like study type / discipline agnostic. So like you can really register anything you want. It's really just for you to advertise like, hey, I'm doing this. Which I kind of like because it creates less hoops. There's also some other domain agnostic ones. Figshare is one, protocols.io is one, research registry. I really like this new open access journal called Social Science Protocols. It's out of University of Edinburgh. And it just publishes social science protocols. So in this case, you would have to kind of write a paper, like a paper before the paper, but you would get another publication out of it, which would be cool. So you can see that, let me just show you. Here's a scoping review protocol. So teaching soft skills in healthcare and higher education, a scoping review protocol. So we can see that this protocol is a bit more of a paper, right? It's more narrative. It's not super long. It's, yeah, 5.5 pages. But let's, you know, it's kind of cool because then you get another publication. And sometimes I think, you know, writing it in narrative form can be useful in terms of, again, really describing what your aims are going to be and what your plan is. And lastly, you can always just register in RU Core, which is Rutgers institutional repository. I haven't seen anyone do this, but I've been talking to a lot of librarians about it. The reason why this might be useful is that RU Core and most other institutional repositories are crawled by Google Scholar. So anything that you register in an institutional repository shows up in Google Scholar, unless you embargo it, which, is also a possibility, but that's more if you're doing like a dissertation. So that's another way to get it out there, is to put it in RU Core. Yeah. So that's just a couple protocol places to register. But there's a huge list on there. So, and a little description under each one. So whatever your kind of team decides is the best route to go, can find different things on there as well. The next thing that you want to do, and this kind of goes hand in hand with the protocol, Prisma does encourage the establishment of this during the protocol phase, is to establish your inclusion and exclusion criteria. So when you start looking at your studies, you are going to have really clear guidelines and boundaries around what should be included and what shouldn't. And that usually involves a lot of conversations about a really strict inclusion and exclusion criteria. I really like this graphic. It's by the University of Melbourne Libraries. And it talks about just some of the inclusion exclusion criteria. It would probably be different based on the study that you're working on. That not all of these would probably apply. If we go back to our PICO example here, one of our inclusion criteria would definitely be rural, which I spelled wrong, rural areas. Another one would be foster youth. So we probably want to hone in on what ages we would want to look at for inclusion. It could even be like study design, right? So like maybe we want to just look at cohort studies for that particular systematic review. Maybe we just want to look at specific outcomes. So those can all be reasons to formulate an inclusion or exclusion criteria. Okay, now we're going to talk about searching, which is kind of the big, the big part of doing a review. It takes probably the most time, I would say. So you write a search strategy. This search strategy gets applied to a bunch of different databases. The more databases you can identify as being useful, the better. The end goal of this search strategy is to make it as comprehensive and reproducible as possible. So by reproducible, I mean that when you publish your systematic review, Prisma recommends publishing the search strategy in the review. Other researchers should be able to copy and paste your strategy into the database that you say you used it for and get the same exact search results that you did. Sometimes that doesn't work because we'll have different institutional memberships to different databases, but it should line up pretty exactly. People should be able to follow step by step what you did to get your results from beginning to end. The comprehensive part comes into play because, like we were talking about earlier, it's really no use to anyone if we only identify a couple of studies, if we only cherry pick the studies that we include, instead of being moderately to extremely certain that we have found every bit of evidence on an available topic that's been published on and put on the internet. So we need to kind of prioritize those two things when we end up searching. One tip that I have before you even start searching is to find a couple of gold standard or seed articles. So these are articles that would be part of the review. Usually the subject matter expert team member is the person to do this. And that helps you test your search, right? Because if you write your strategy and those articles aren't showing up, that means there's something wrong with your strategy. You're not capturing the particular question that you're trying to ask through your search strategy. So those gold standard articles are kind of an essential part. Like when I help with a systematic review, it's often one of the first questions I ask now is for them to give me some, 1 or 2 gold standard articles so that I can see what they're kind of considering to be a good example of something they would include, and B, so that they can, that we can test our strategy against those articles. Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about databases. The next step is kind of to determine what databases you want to use. I've screenshotted a bunch of database logos here. Hopefully, or I'm sure definitely all of these look familiar to y'all. The thing about using the databases for your review is that it's really advantageous for that comprehensiveness piece for you to find for you to use as many databases as you can that fit your review type. So my recommendation is to hone in on the salient subject-specific databases. So for instance, PsycInfo is a subject-specific database. It's, behavioral health literature. PubMed is another subject-specific database. And then pull from a interdisciplinary database. The 2 that we have available to us at Rutgers are Web of Science and Scopus. Web of Science and Scopus are both great. And the reason that it's good to pull from an interdisciplinary database is because there might be literature outside of your field that kind of pertains to, what you're looking at. Interdisciplinary databases also include Google Scholar, but I recommend not using Google Scholar for at least the main searching you're going to do in your review. It's fine if you want to get like background info or you want to double check that you found everything later on. But Google Scholar is run by Google, so it uses an algorithm to sort its results. And because Google is a private company, that algorithm is kind of a black box. It's not possible to really know how they're sorting things. So if you have to use it, use incognito mode and log out of your account. But even then, sometimes it does weird things because, they're watching us at all times. So, Google Scholar can be great for certain things. We're going to talk in a second about gray literature, but it is really not something that I would prioritize as like, this is a database we searched in our review for sources. Search strategy steps. So when you write a search strategy and you publish it in a systematic review, it's going to look something like this. It's going to look very long. This is organized really nicely. A librarian probably wrote this. I think this is from a protocol that was, no, this is from Nature Sustainability. But basically the point I'm trying to make about this is that your search strategy is extremely long. It will be a lot of words, a lot of little characters, a lot of punctuation, and it's okay if this looks like a bunch of nonsense to you right now. So the 4th workshop I'm teaching is on how to build a search strategy. So we'll talk more about that. And this is what I do in a lot of my consultations too, is I help people write search strategies. And if I'm a co-author on your review, I'll write the strategy for you as well. But this is just to show you, like, this is kind of what you end up with is something like this. So I think this review was about interventions for crop post-harvest loss reduction in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So we can see those elements, right? This looks like the kind of crop loss element. This looks, like maybe this is the crop element. This is the loss element. And then we see, like, down here, I kind of cut it off, but it goes on to say all of the countries that would be in the population or the contextual area. So I just wanted to show you that before I talk about how we get there. How we get there is we first think about our concepts, right? So we break things down into keywords. And then because we want to be as comprehensive as possible, we don't just search those keywords. We also search the synonyms and related ideas of those keywords. So if you see here, we've got this kind of like crop loss section here. We've got every different type of crop loss you could possibly get. So we have pests, rodents, fungi, injury, wound, rat, termite, like stack burn. So any possible way that they could represent the word crop loss, they used. So you brainstorm all of that, and then everything that you brainstorm, you put together and you do a preliminary search. This is where you might start to check to see if those gold standard articles are showing up. You gain more information from this search. Usually you find a couple papers that look good. You might take a peek at the keywords that they're using, add those to your list of keywords that you've established. You might see some authors that use different phrasing that you hadn't thought of, so you throw that in there. You also establish subject headings, which are another way to kind of categorize articles. So we use kind of natural language keywords, but we also have categories that a database will put on an article. So it's helpful to search both the category and the natural language. And that's something I'll, again, talk more about in the searching workshop, which if you can't make it to, I'll absolutely record it, or you can always make appointments with me for that kind of nitty-gritty stuff as well. Then you combine all of that together with punctuation, which I'll touch on the punctuation in a moment. It's a huge string like the one we just looked at, and then you search it. And what you come up with is a set of articles that hopefully gets closer to the articles or to the type of article that you want to actually include in your review. Just to briefly touch on a couple of the things that might be in a search strategy, we have things like parentheses, which group different ideas together. We can see, this kind of crop loss one, it's all in one parentheses group. Quotation marks are searching exact phrases. I'm sure some of this is familiar to y'all. Asterisks are fill in the blank. So if you type in this word with an asterisk, it will do, etc. Fills in the blank where the asterisk is. Boolean operators. Is everyone familiar with Boolean operators? Okay, cool. And lastly, proximity operators, which is a way to find words within X number of words of another word. So if I did something like this, it would force the database to find the word foster within 3 words of the word youth. Some databases use this ADJ, some people use this N, it depends on the database. So those are all things you might encounter. I'm going to skip ahead a tiny bit. Which brings me to translation. So once you write this strategy for one database, you have to translate it to the next, because as I just mentioned, different databases will use different syntax for the searching. So where one database might use one letter or word to represent a proximity operator, another one will use a different one. Where one database will use a certain set of subject headings, another will use different subject headings. So does everyone know what mesh is from PubMed? Maybe, no. Mesh is an example of a big subject heading thesaurus, but only certain databases use it. So if they don't use mesh, you have to find a different database thesaurus. Again, happy to help with guidance on this part. And this is something we'll talk about in that search strategy workshop as well. Okay, so you do all of that, you run your searches. This is kind of where we would be now, right? So we do a preliminary search, we establish everything, we craft the search strategy. And then we get to the final element of the search, which is to citation chain. So for every study that you find, you look through the references of that study to make sure you haven't missed anything, or to add on any articles that also should be included. So what we have all of this information, but it's just scholarly literature, right? It's just stuff in the databases. What about stuff outside of the databases? I'm sure you're all like, oh God, that was already so much. But there's more. There's gray literature. So gray literature is anything that's not formally published in a journal. This could be a dissertation, it could be a book chapter, it could be a government report. There's, many, many things that could be gray literature. If we're thinking about, like UN fact sheets, that would be a piece of gray literature. The LibGuide has tons of resources for looking at gray literature, but I just kind of wanted to stress that it's important to search the gray literature alongside your databases. And that search is usually a little bit less formulaic than the database searching is, because, as we know, searching a search bar of a website is really different than searching in a scholarly database. And again, lots of resources to help in that regard as well. Just a couple of reasons to consider searching gray literature. One is null findings. So I think I've been in this situation a few times where I gather data and I analyze it and there's kind of a null effect. And so I say, oh, okay, I'm going to just make this into a conference paper instead of a paper that's going to be published in a journal, because people don't want to read about null findings, right? But that doesn't mean they're not important when we're thinking about the impact of an intervention, right? So it's important to search, conference publications, which Google Scholar has most often, policy reports, which may discuss a particular intervention or outcome, thesis and dissertations, which have a ton of detail. Usually you can citation chain those to see what they cited, see if anything else comes up that way as well. So the gray literature is really, really rich. It's kind of a pain in the butt to search. You have to really discuss with your team about how you're going to proceed in that regard, but it does end up being a more quality review at the end. Questions about any of that? Okay. All right. So we've gathered up all this information, right? We have all of these articles. We probably have some gray literature. So what do you do next? The next step is to screen it all. So this is where the team really becomes not just useful, but essential. You gather up all of your sources that you found and you put them in the software of your choice that you're going to use for screening. A lot of people now are using Covidence, which is a Cochrane product that kind of automates the screening, not automates, but just makes the screening process easier. Some people just use EndNote. EndNote has a lot of documentation. People use Zotero. Some people just use a spreadsheet, which I think is kind of tough, but it's definitely been done. And you screen your articles. So first you remove any duplicates. So, sometimes an article will turn up in one database and another, so you can toss one of the duplicates out. And then you do 2 passes with screening. The first pass, you remove irrelevant things based on just title and abstract. The second pass, you look at everything that's still there and you read the full article. If you exclude articles at that second pass stage, you have to justify in writing why you did so. And that's from Prisma. If you and your maybe co-screener are in a disagreement, then a third person has to usually be a tiebreaker as well. And then you report all of that in your review in a nifty looking flow diagram that looks like this. So you can see that this is really detailed. This is from Prisma again, and I think they have a template so you could just type right in your numbers, but we can see it's, records from each database, records that were screened, records that were sought for retrieval. So that means you read the full text, and then assessed for eligibility. So that's the critical appraisal stage, which we'll talk about in a second. And then, finally you get to stuff you included. This chart has a gray literature section. So this is like identification of studies via databases. And then this side is via other methods, via internet sources, for instance. Questions about flow diagrams? So you can see this is like, you really have to keep track of everything that you're finding. So like if you're using EndNote or another citation management system, I would say put, for the folder that you download for each database, put the number of records on the folder name. So that way you're really keeping a close eye on everything that you find. All right. Screening tools. I think I've touched on all of these already. We can do reference managers. We have specific screening software that's come out. We don't have institutional subscriptions to any of the screening software. Covidence is the big one. Some schools are starting to get it. I'm trying to push for it, but I haven't been successful so far. But if you have grant funding or research funds, you can also purchase a subscription, like I'm working with a team that bought like a package for you can do like 3 reviews on it a year or something like that. So and it was pretty decent price. So like there are options. Rayan is the other screening tool. Rayan used to be completely free and now it's not, which is really sad. But there's still, I know it's like always such a bummer. But there is a basic version that's still free, but I'm not entirely sure how much functionality that still has. But that's also an option as well.
But I'm sorry, can I ask, but you think EndNote is better than Zotero for this? Because I like Zotero a lot. I mean, I haven't used EndNote in years, but it was never great.
I haven't either. I am a Zotero girl as well. I love Zotero. So EndNote has more documentation on how to use it for a review. However, in this intensive, this institute I just was at, some of the folks there were saying that they've seen a lot more resurgence of Zotero being used for systematic reviews. So, and I guess there's a paper that's going to come out that's comparing the two. So I'll put that on the LibGuide when it comes out, because I would much rather use Zotero. I love Zotero. And Zotero is open source, right? So like the more people that use it for that purpose, probably the more functionality Zotero users will build in to, having it for systematic reviews, which is nice. Yeah. Critical appraisal. Okay, so you've identified all of your studies, you screen them, you've tie broken, you end up with X number. Now it's time to assess if they're quality. If we go back to our table example here, we can see that each study got a quality assessment score here. So that's what we'll do here. At this stage, there are many different critical appraisal tools that you can use. My favorite is called CASP, Critical Appraisal Skills Program. It has tons of different checklists, right? So if you're just looking at qualitative studies, there's a PDF checklist that you can use. If you're just looking at cohort studies, if you only want to look at randomized trials, if you are looking at other systematic reviews, you have a checklist. So those are really, really helpful and really highly regarded as a quality tool. And they make it really easy. You just, go down the checklist, find the elements, give it a score, and then you include it or exclude it based on that particular score that you gave it. I also, like everything, have a page on the LibGuide with dozens of literally tons of different critical appraisal tools. Some of them are specific to a particular discipline. So, you might be able to rule some of them out. That's why I like CASP, because it's kind of discipline agnostic. Doesn't have you can use it regardless. But some of these, for instance, one of the best ones is Strobe, but Strobe is just for epidemiology. So it's a little less used. But CASP is definitely where I would say to start if you're interested in writing a review and you get to that stage. Then you extract your data. The extraction process, choose it, you kind of decide as a team what you want to pull from each study. You pull the data. Like everything, there's a lot of different tools. I've seen people just use a spreadsheet. I've seen people get a software package for extraction. Again, there's a page on the LibGuide that has, I feel like I just say that a lot, like there's a page with tons of different things, but we've got this nifty table, right? So some people use like a Google form and they'll type in and then submit and it generates, it generates the spreadsheet for them. You just use a Word doc. It kind of just depends on what your team decides. But all of those are valid extraction methods. Prisma has some items for extraction as well to make sure that you're kind of staying within the bounds of like what you should be reporting on when you write your review about extraction. And then describe your findings. So at this stage, you perform your meta-analysis or write your findings in a narrative table or do both. Again, Prisma is your very best friend throughout all of this. It'll help you report and say how to report and what to report. There's also a section about writing and reporting in the LibGuide, which I'm not going to scroll through because I feel like by now you're like, okay, I've got the LibGuide. All right, so that's it. Those are the steps. Then you publish, hopefully. So that, like I said, it's a ton of information. I'm here to help. Are there any questions?
No, this was just really helpful, having all of the links to all the different tools and how the tools compare to one another and the registry. I mean, not just, and knowing that it's all on the LibGuide stuff. So that's just, I could have gone over there to look at it, but it was helpful to have you explain it and walk us through all that. So
yeah, and I feel like, yeah, having someone be like, okay, here's where to go. Here's my recommendations, in this sea of tools. That's what I wish I would have had when I was starting to figure this whole big evidence synthesis thing out. So I'm glad it's been helpful.
Do you have any exemplar, scoping reviews and systematic reviews that, I mean, I know that's hard because there's just, 8 million, topics out there. So which one would you choose? But I just wonder if there's some you've come across that you would recommend.
Yeah. So in the guide, there's a, under this types of evidence synthesis page, I've got an example in the social sciences for each review type.
Of course.
I tried to make it really thorough. Again, because I was like, I need this. But you can always, if you're like, Julia, I need help finding a review in X topic. I'm always happy to, I've gotten pretty fast at appraising them for quality. So I'm always happy to help you find a few that would fit your criteria if you need one to read or reference as well. So good question. Other questions?
I have a question on when you stop recording. I'll ask you a question, but I don't want to stop others from asking questions. So go ahead, Kristen.
No, I was just gonna say this was excellent. Just
thank you.
walking through all the stuff, and it looks like this page is so organized. So it'll be great to start using it. And I guess the only other question I was gonna say is if you could send. I wanted to find out. I lost the other training, so.
Oh yeah, I'll send it out again. Yeah,
Okay.
for sure.
Thank you.
I can send it to you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Just real quick before we wrap up, I have a quick slide about how I can help. So this is also on the LibGuide, but I like to highlight it. So librarians, hopefully, as you've seen, can be a pretty big asset to your review. They're associated with higher quality systematic reviews across a couple of different publications. So I can help. I can be a consultant on your review, which means I help kind of just advise, teach, point you in the right direction. I'm also open to co-authorship in that realm. if I'm able to make, if I can find the bandwidth to agree to it, I'll write your search strategy and your method section of the paper, and I'll do the Prisma diagram, and I kind of act as a project manager in a sense, not as in-depth as maybe like a project manager in a lab does, but in kind of giving us pointers on, okay, now that we've done this, now we need to do this kind of a situation. So that's also an option. And again, on the LibGuide, there's a list of things I'll do for each kind of tier as well. A couple last minute thoughts. Systematic reviews are super iterative. I feel like every time I help with one, I get better at doing them. And I'm sure you'll find the same, the comfort level, confidence goes up and up. There's a wealth of resources for each step. If you haven't already found out, but you just kind of have to know where to look or who to ask, which you can ask me. And again, the goal isn't ever to be an expert in every single one of these steps. It's more just like feeling confident in being able to start them and know where to go to develop more skills. Okay, so that's all I have. I have one more survey for y'all, if that's okay. Let me stop sharing. So this is going to be the same survey as last time with a different end question. Yeah, Sage, I will, I'll share the slides out. Actually, let me put them in a PDF form right now. Oh, Andrea, I'm glad it's been useful. Yeah, here we go. There's the slides. I'll also put them on the LibGuide and send an email to everyone with the recording. Let me grab my little Zoom or my little Qualtrics link. Okay, so there's the survey. Would super duper appreciate y'all taking it. I'm going to stop recording. I'm going to